Picture this. Right now, as you sit in front of your screen, there are millions of requests flying across the internet every single second. Someone streaming a show, someone checking their bank balance, someone booking a flight, someone sending a message to a person on the other side of the world. All of that is happening invisibly, effortlessly, in what feels like magic. And behind almost every single one of those transactions, quietly humming in server rooms and data centers across the globe, is an operating system that most people have never even used. Not Windows, not Mac OS, Linux. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. The story of how Linux didn't just compete with Windows, but methodically, completely, and irreversibly displaced it from nearly every place that actually matters in modern computing. That story has been hiding in plain sight for years, buried under a mountain of misleading headlines and marketing noise. Today, we are going to dig it out. Let's be very clear about something right from the start. This isn't a video for die-hard Linux enthusiasts who already know the talking points. This isn't a tribalistic tech debate about which operating system has the prettier interface. This is a clear-eyed look at publicly available data, at infrastructure decisions made by the biggest technology companies on the planet, at the choices made by the people who actually build software for a living, and what all of that data, when you look at it together, actually means. Because the conclusion it points to is one that the mainstream technology conversation has been remarkably reluctant to say out loud, so we're going to say it. Let's start with a number. One number. A number so significant that if it were describing market share in almost any other industry, it would be front page news, and would have been front page news the moment it crossed even half that threshold. That number is 96.3, as in 96.3%. Or that is the percentage of the world's top 1 million web servers that run Linux. Not a majority, not a supermajority, a near total monopoly. The internet, the actual infrastructure that carries the videos you watch, the emails you send, the websites you visit, the payments you make, runs on Linux at a rate that makes Windows' presence in that space a statistical footnote rather than a genuine alternative. Think about what you did on the internet today. Every page that loaded, every search result that appeared, every piece of content that streamed to your device, almost certainly served by a machine running Linux, and you never thought about it once because that's exactly how good infrastructure works. It disappears. But that 96% figure is just the beginning. If we stop there, we've only told a fraction of the story. Because the real story isn't just about web servers. The real story is about what happened when cloud computing arrived and rewrote the rules of the entire technology industry. When Amazon built AWS, Amazon Web Services, and essentially invented the modern cloud computing industry, they didn't build it on Windows. They built it on Linux. Why? Because at the scale AWS operates, Linux's performance characteristics, its flexibility, its open source customizability, and critically, its cost structure. No per instance licensing fees. Made it the only rational choice. Today, AWS handles approximately a third of the entire global internet's cloud workloads, all of it running on Linux infrastructure. Google Cloud Platform, which handles a massive chunk of the remaining market, is also built on Linux. Not just any Linux, but Linux that Google's own engineers have spent years optimizing and customizing specifically for the demands of operating at planetary scale. And then there's Microsoft Azure. And this is where the story takes a turn that is almost poetic in its irony. Microsoft, the company whose entire identity for decades was Windows, the company that spent billions fighting Linux, that had executives call open source software a cancer, that built its empire on the Windows licensing model, that Microsoft built a cloud platform, and by 2019, more than half of the virtual machine instances running on that platform were running Linux. Not Windows, Linux. The Windows company's own cloud runs more Linux than Windows. Let that sink in for a moment. Because that single fact communicates something that no amount of desktop market share statistics can. The people inside Microsoft who are responsible for actually building and running the infrastructure that will define computing for the next decade chose Linux. Not out of ideology. Not because they were Linux fans, because for the workloads that matter at cloud scale, Linux is simply the better tool. Now, if you want to understand which operating system the world's most technically sophisticated people trust for the most critical and demanding computing tasks imaginable, there's a list you should know about. It's called the Top 500 list, and it ranks the 500 most powerful supercomputers on the planet. These are the machines doing climate modeling, nuclear physics simulation, pharmaceutical research, financial risk calculation, aerospace engineering, the machines where a system crash isn't an inconvenience. It's potentially a scientific setback worth months of work and millions of dollars. The machines where performance isn't a preference, it's an existential requirement. As of November 2017, every single one of those 500 most powerful computers in the world runs Linux. Not 490 of them, not 498, all 500, 100%. And that figure has held steady ever since, year after year, list after list. The people who build weather forecasting systems that governments rely on to issue hurricane warnings chose Linux. The research teams running simulations to understand how proteins fold in the search for new cancer treatments chose Linux. The financial institutions modeling systemic risk across global markets chose Linux. These are not casual technology decisions. These are decisions made by people who understand computing at a depth that most of us will never reach, and who face consequences for getting those decisions wrong that most of us will never experience. They all chose Linux, unanimously, consistently, with no sign of changing. Here's something else worth considering, though. Even if you grant all of that, even if you accept that servers and supercomputers and cloud platforms all run Linux, you might still be inclined to say, yes, but those are specialized environments. The average person doesn't interact with servers directly. The average person uses a phone or a laptop. And on the laptop, Windows still dominates. Fair point. So let's talk about the device that is, for the majority of the world's population, their primary computer, the device they use more hours per day than anything else, the device in their pocket. Android runs on approximately 72% of the world's smartphones. And Android is Linux, not inspired by Linux, not built with Linux ideas. Android's core is the Linux kernel, the same fundamental codebase. When Google needed to build an operating system for a device that would be used by billions of people across wildly different hardware configurations, that needed to be extraordinarily stable, that needed to be customizable by hundreds of different hardware manufacturers, and that needed to run efficiently on battery-powered processors. They built it on Linux, because Linux's architecture, its stability, its security model, its adaptability, those qualities made it the right foundation for the most widely deployed computing platform in human history. So, when we count the actual number of devices running Linux-based operating systems, servers, cloud infrastructure, supercomputers, smartphones, smart TVs, home routers, automotive infotainment systems, industrial control equipment, the billions of Internet of Things devices embedded in everything from factory floors to hospital equipment, the number of Linux-powered devices dwarfs the number of Windows devices by a margin that makes Windows desktop dominance look like a regional niche rather than global leadership. This is the thing the mainstream technology conversation consistently gets wrong. It measures the operating system war by counting desktop computers, because desktop computers are what most technology journalists use, and because Microsoft's marketing budget funds a significant portion of technology media's revenue cycle. But desktop computers are not where computing lives anymore. Not primarily, not for most people. Mobile computing already displaced the desktop as humanity's primary computing interface years ago. Cloud computing displaced the on-premises server as the primary enterprise computing infrastructure years ago. Yet the battlefield where the operating system war was actually going to be decided was never the desktop. And on every other battlefield, Linux didn't just win, Linux won completely. But there's one more dimension of this story that matters enormously for understanding where things are headed, and that's what happened inside the developer community. Because developers are not just users of computing platforms. They are the people who determine, through the software they build, what value those platforms deliver to everyone else. If the developers leave a platform, the platform's future value proposition weakens, and eventually the users follow. The Stack Overflow Developer Survey is the largest and most methodologically consistent annual survey of professional software developers in the world. It has been running for over 2 decades and captures the technology preferences of hundreds of thousands of working developers every year. And what it has been documenting over the past several years is a clear, consistent, unmistakable trend. Professional developers have been migrating away from Windows as their primary development environment. In the most recent surveys, more professional developers use Linux or Mac OS as their primary working environment than use Windows. The people who build software have decided, through the aggregate of their individual professional choices, that Linux is the better tool for building software. This is significant for a reason that goes beyond simple platform preference. The developer who uses Linux daily builds mental models and workflows optimized for Linux. The tools they write, the documentation they produce, the projects they create, all of it is shaped by Linux assumptions. The developer ecosystem produces Linux native tooling, Linux native workflows, Linux native culture. And that culture, in turn, shapes what the next generation of computing infrastructure looks like. Microsoft, to their significant credit, read the signal correctly, and their response to it reveals something important. When they realized that developers were leaving Windows for Linux development environments, they didn't respond by building a better Windows development environment, competitive enough to bring developers back. Instead, they built the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL, which is essentially a way to run a Linux environment inside Windows. They shipped Linux inside Windows. Think about what that decision communicates. Microsoft's message to developers was not, Windows is better for development. Let us show you why. It was, Linux is better for development, and we will deliver Linux to you inside our platform so you don't have to leave. That is an admission, stated in engineering decisions rather than marketing language, about the relative quality of the two environments for the work that developers actually do. And then there is the security story, which has accelerated enterprise decision-making in ways that are only now becoming fully visible in the infrastructure migration data. The ransomware epidemic of the past 5 years has been, almost exclusively, a Windows ransomware epidemic. Not because Windows engineers are incompetent, not because Microsoft doesn't care about security, but because of something more fundamental. Windows security architecture was designed in an era when computers weren't connected to global networks full of adversarial actors. It was designed for a world where the threat model was relatively benign, where most users were on isolated machines, where the emphasis was on ease of use and broad compatibility rather than on privilege separation and attack surface minimization. Linux's security architecture, by contrast, was designed from the very beginning for a multi-user networked environment. The principle of least privilege, the idea that every process, every user, every piece of software should have access to only exactly what it needs and nothing more, isn't a feature added on top of Linux. It's structural. It's baked into the architecture at the most fundamental level. This structural difference means that the malware ecosystem, which has been optimized over decades specifically to exploit Windows architecture, hits Linux environments very differently. The privilege escalation paths that ransomware relies on to spread through Windows networks simply don't exist in the same way in a properly configured Linux environment. Enterprise IT security teams have lived this difference in the most visceral way possible. Watching ransomware attacks encrypt entire Windows-based infrastructure stacks, paying multi-million-dollar ransoms, or spending weeks rebuilding from backups. And then asking the obvious question, what would have happened if we'd been running Linux? The answer to that question has been driving enterprise Linux adoption at a pace that the desktop market share statistics don't capture because enterprise server and workload migrations happen below the waterline of what gets measured in the headline statistics. Now, let's address the counter-argument honestly, because intellectual honesty requires it. Windows is not gone. Windows is not going to be gone next year or the year after. The desktop market share statistics that show Windows running on the majority of the world's personal computers are accurate. Institutional inertia is real. Hundreds of millions of people use Windows-specific applications that don't have functional Linux equivalents for their specific workflows. The enterprise desktop transition to Linux is happening, but it is happening gradually. And gradual in computing terms can still mean a decade or more. Gaming is the specific use case where Windows maintains a genuinely significant advantage that has real staying power. Microsoft's investment in DirectX, their relationships with game developers, and the sheer volume of Windows native gaming titles represent a moat that isn't going to disappear quickly. The progress of Steam on Linux, the commercial success of the Steam Deck, and Valve's ongoing investment in Linux gaming compatibility are eroding that moat, but slowly and incompletely. So let's be precise about what we're actually saying. We're not saying Windows is irrelevant today. We're saying Windows relevance has been fundamentally reframed in ways that most of the mainstream conversation hasn't grappled with. Honestly, Windows is the dominant operating system for desktop personal computing. That's real. But personal desktop computing is no longer the center of gravity of the computing universe. It is one specific use case in an ecosystem of computing that extends from your pocket to your car, to the server rooms that run global commerce, to the research facilities that advance human knowledge. And in that broader ecosystem, Linux doesn't just compete with Windows. Linux is the foundation. The cloud runs on Linux. The internet runs on Linux. The supercomputers run on Linux. The smartphones run on Linux. The AI revolution, which might be the most consequential technological development of the next several decades, is running on Linux. Every major machine learning framework, every GPU accelerated training cluster, every large language model being trained right now is running on Linux infrastructure. NVIDIA's CUDA ecosystem, which powers the majority of AI computation on the planet, runs on Linux. The engineers building the systems that will define what computing looks like in 2035 are writing their code on Linux and running it on Linux. This is what makes the mainstream conversation's continued framing of the operating system debate as Windows versus Linux so frustrating. It's not that the debate is wrong, it's that it's measuring the wrong thing. The debate asks, who has more desktop users? When the question that actually matters for understanding the future of computing is, whose architecture forms the foundation of the computing infrastructure that will dominate the next decade? And that question has an answer. It has had an answer for years. The answer is Linux. There is a concept in technology history called the innovator's dilemma, and one of its core insights is that dominant platforms tend to be displaced not through frontal assault, but through the quiet development of a parallel infrastructure that eventually becomes so large and so important that the original platform's dominance looks, in retrospect, like it was always a niche. IBM didn't lose to another mainframe company. It lost to the PC revolution that made mainframes irrelevant for most use cases. Microsoft didn't lose a desktop battle. It watched Linux build an entirely parallel infrastructure. Server, cloud, mobile, embedded, HPC. That gradually became the actual nervous system of global computing, while Windows remained the dominant interface for people sitting at desks. What we are in the middle of right now is not the climax of this story. The climax already happened. Quietly, over the course of about 15 years, Linux became the operating system of the internet, of the cloud, of the world's most powerful computers, of the world's most widely used mobile platform, and of the developer community that will build the software of the next decade. The mainstream conversation is just catching up to a fait accompli. The computing infrastructure, whose Linux foundation already exists, is not going to be rebuilt on Windows. The cloud architecture that every major enterprise is migrating their workloads toward runs on Linux. The AI infrastructure that will define competitive advantage for the next generation of technology companies runs on Linux. The mobile platforms that will remain the dominant consumer computing interface for the foreseeable future run on Linux. The path back to Windows dominance in those spaces would require dismantling and rebuilding infrastructure that represents trillions of dollars of investment and decades of engineering work. It's not going to happen. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a clear picture that is more nuanced than Linux killed Windows in the dramatic overnight sense, but more decisive than the mainstream conversation acknowledges. Windows is the past of personal desktop computing and a significant present. Linux is the present of nearly everything else, and the foundation of the computing future in every dimension that matters for where technology is actually going. The question this should leave you with isn't which operating system to root for. It's a deeper question about how we consume technology information and why a shift of this magnitude, one that is documented in publicly available data, confirmed by the infrastructure decisions of every major technology company in the world, and validated by the revealed preferences of the professional community that builds software for a living, took so long to break through into mainstream awareness. The answer to that question probably has something to do with marketing budgets, something to do with the way technology journalism tends to cover the tools that journalists themselves use, and something to do with the very human tendency to measure what's easy to measure rather than what's actually important. The data has been saying this for years. The infrastructure has been confirming it. The developers have been living it. Now you know it too. And knowing it changes how you see every headline about the technology industry, every conversation about platform strategy, every claim about who is winning the computing war. Because the war is over. The result just wasn't announced in the way wars usually are. It was written line by line in the architecture of the infrastructure that runs the world.